Hi, everyone. So, in Tuesday's lecture, I introduced to you my favorite play of all time, Edward Albee's The Goat, or Who is Sylvia? And you have started reading this play. In this initial lecture, I talked about this idea of how the postmodern condition, which really becomes popularized in a lot of media and literature in the 60s, is very much at the heart of Albee's play. And in particular, like mentioned in Tuesday's lecture, I talked about how morality and ethics began to be questioned because now that we have eschewed this idea of a master narrative or a universal truth, which had been beget by certain institutions that had the more dominant powers in Western philosophy and culture for so long, vis-a-vis the church or government institutions, prevailing philosophies, or what we might refer to as hegemonic constructions. Now, we are dealing with a scholarly age where we are trying to somehow adhere to the fact that we understand that an ideology that is perceived as common sense by the masses, or hegemony, as we all know that word now, can actually wind up being short-sighted and oppressive, especially in relationship to a country like ours, or the West in general, where there are multiple identities and perspectives, nationalities that all congregate in the same space, right? When we were more of a monolithic culture, it was easy to have something like quote unquote common sense because everyone shared in the same value systems. However, when we are dealing with cultures from all over the world which have established religions and various philosophies that might incorporate different definitions of what common sense means, it complicates the perspective quite a bit because you cannot rely on everyone adhering to exactly the same values. Now, there might be some relationship between the values, right? Most cultures and religions believe in being good to one another, to be sound in mind and body, to exact kindness upon others in the world, right? These are kind of common traits that we can see permeated within all cultures. However, the way that their philosophical foundation is established has different either tonalities or approaches or priorities around a lot of what they espouse as being a good human, being a good citizen, being a good devotee. Yeah. And so the postmodern condition ushers in this idea that we need to privilege all of these different ideologies because otherwise, if we just adhered to the one that was dominant, it would oppress all those other people. And we know it has, right? This is the reason why we had slavery. This is the reason why we've had xenophobia. This is the reason why we've had homophobia and transphobia. I mean, all of these things are developed because these marginal communities have different value systems, perhaps. And when they rub up against a dominant culture, the dominant culture typically will oppress. And that has been the goal of the postmodern condition. This comes with challenges, though, because naturally, if we're going to entertain and privilege all of the various ideologies that potentially will coexist in a culture, you begin to ask the fundamental questions. Okay, well, what is then the ethical way to be? What is the good way to become a person? What constitutes the priority to operate within your own social sphere and certainly your national sphere, etc., right? And this is the natural externality or complication that will exist as a result of trying to understand and embody all the various perspectives. It's a difficult thing to do. It's much easier to rest on a singular ideology. But of course, we know that that has its own repercussions. Now, Albee is playing around with that in his play. As you know now, there are a lot of moral surprises in this play. And every single character is negotiating various value systems that have become their priority. And what ensues is, well, potentially ethical and moral chaos. And that is what you're trying to negotiate. Now, I'm going to bring in another concept that reignites as a result of this kind of postmodern condition. And it is the concept of laissez-faire capitalism and how it begins to construct the American mind, especially once Ronald Reagan was elected as president. There was an interesting shift in our economics in the country. Between 1945, or the end of World War II, and 1980, the American economic system was built on a Keynesian consensus. And that is named after the economist John Maynard Keynes, who had a series of macroeconomic theories about how in the short run, and especially during recessions, economic output is strongly influenced by, like aggregate demand, total spending in the economy, right? And that aggregate demand does not necessarily equal the productive capacity of the economy. Instead, it is influenced by a host of factors and sometimes behaves erratically, affecting production, employment, inflation. And what this kind of Keynesian model argued was that aggregate demand is volatile and unstable. A market economy often experiences inefficient macroeconomic outcomes. And the form of economic recessions, when demand is low, of course, and inflation when demand is high, and that these can be mitigated by economic policy responses. So America, during this period, had, in many cases, like heavy government involvement in the development of policies for the economy. And that was for these purposes, to kind of mitigate those macroeconomic outcomes. With the election of Reagan, however, we went to a 19th century model of economics that was built around, as you may have read about in the past, a laissez-faire economy, or what some people refer to more in a pejorative sense as neoliberalism. It is embracing a free market capitalism, and it's generally associated with the policies of privatization, deregulation, globalization, free trade, austerity, reductions in government spending in order to increase the role of the private sector in the economy. And the way that is argued as a virtue is that naturally human beings are competitive, and if you remove the restrictions from any kind of government policies, for example, if you remove those restrictions, there will be an amassing of wealth that will then trickle down into the rest of the economy. And so both of these have been argued by economists as being virtuous, right? But it was definitely a shift in 1980 when we went to this model. And so over that time, especially during Reagan's administration, but then much into Clinton's administration, and certainly the Bush years, slowly but surely, the government was no longer given as many policy rights to regulate the way, for example, the business community operated. This is where you see more advertisements that are legalized, For example, in pharmaceuticals, we are the only country, along with New Zealand, to have pharmaceutical advertisements. Because in laissez-faire capitalism, it argues that you can't regulate your people. They need to be able to make the choices that they want. And certainly a business in America is perceived as an individual based on the 1888 Supreme Court case, Santa Clara County versus the Southern Pacific Railroad. So corporations in the United States are recognized as individuals. And so in this model, they can operate as individuals as well, and they have the rights to under the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, right? So we have pharmaceutical companies who are allowed to advertise on television for their medications. Now, in most countries around the world, actually all countries but New Zealand and the US, of course, I say this, and at the time New Zealand is about to regulate it as well, many of the other countries believe that it is false advertising and that it can actually lead to hindrances to hinder the social welfare. And that is the reason why the governments have created regulations around such action. What laissez-faire economic liberalism or neoliberalism would say to that is the people must make the decisions. When you rely on the government to regulate those decisions for you, even in an economic sense for social welfare, you are restricting the natural order of the way that humans behave. Now, why this is important to the play is because what neoliberalism does is it ushers in what many people call late capitalism, which has a value system attached to it. As we know, our values, our morals, are dictated by many different factors, one of them being our economic models. And the economic philosophy that is prevailing at the time under this kind of laissez-faire ideal also purports and incites or even inspires a hyper-individualism, right? If there is no regulation, if there is no considerations for a collective or less considerations for a collective social welfare, and that there is more of an emphasis on every person is responsible for themselves, well, you can imagine that the morality and the ethics that develop as a result also would take on this kind of hyper-individualism. Now, you can imagine that this development of this economic model and its subsequent ways that it might influence ethics and morality, coupled with the fact that we have already entered into a postmodern condition where we are beginning to privilege more the marginal perspectives and ideas, and they get thrown into the pot as well. Well, we have even further emphasis on the developments of individual ethics, the developments of individual morality, and we begin to say things like, well, you're entitled to your opinion. This is mine, this is yours. We deem ourselves agents of our own navigation of the world and society, right? And so Albee is speaking to these conditions that are currently existing in a late capitalist, which is more of an economic perspective, and a postmodern, which is more of a sociocultural perspective. These things combined create kind of a perfect storm for examining ethical relativism, this idea that nothing is fixed and our ethics largely are determined by personal or individual association and articulation. So, once again, we look at scenography recapitulating cosmography. We look at how the ideas of a society at the moment in a certain place and time influence the cultural production of the day. And despite the fact that The Goat or Who is Sylvia is a new millennium play, we can already begin to see the devices of a relatively newer economic model that has become popularized begin to influence the artists of the era. So continue with your torture over the ethics and morality of the four characters that we see in The Goat or Who is Sylvia. And I can't wait for you all to fully dive in to the discussion about who you believe to be the most morally reprehensible and giving your reasons why, and maybe just considering how even economic models and sociocultural theories can influence the developments of the self. Have a great week, and I'll see you next week when we start watching Hedwig and the Angry Inch. I'll talk more about that later. It's going to be an interesting week. It's going to be very personal. All right, y'all. Have a wonderful time.